The geometric perfection of the Unified Coalition's exploration cruiser, the Radiant Axiom, reflected a galaxy governed entirely by mathematics. For Commander Xylos, a high-ranking surveyor of the crystalline-skinned Valen species, existence was a series of beautifully resolved equations. The Valen had spent 10,000 cycles charting the cosmos, never finding an anomaly that could not be broken down into a probability matrix. Their routine mission today was to scan the peripheral boundary of the Void of Moros, a violent nebula of hyper-dense dark matter and unpredictable gravitational shears where the mathematics of survival always resolved to absolute zero. 2 centuries ago, a newly FTL-capable species known as humanity had launched a massive colony vessel named the Indomitable. Lacking refined navigation algorithms, the humans relied on crude propulsion and sheer momentum, eventually suffering a catastrophic failure that sent them drifting straight into the crushing pressure of the nebula. The High Council logged the event as a tragic but mathematically inevitable consequence of primitive engineering. However, as Xylos' cruiser skirted the edge of the pitch-black storm clouds, the long-range scanners suddenly let out a sharp chime, picking up a structured, active energy emission pulsing from deep within the dead zone. The system returned an error code as the active beacon defied the random chaos of the dark matter storm, flashing in an archaic human tracking protocol known as Morse code. It was not a plea for help, but a declaration of presence. Xylos' peers urged him to turn back, arguing that entering the nebula was a pointless risk and that survival was a mathematical impossibility for such fragile creatures. Driven by a need to reconcile the impossible data, Xylos buckled himself into the pilot's seat of a reinforced reconnaissance shuttle and prepared to cross the threshold into a place where logic went to die. The descent into the Moros Nebula felt like plunging into an ocean of liquid shadow and static electricity. The moment the shuttle crossed the boundary, the pristine, mathematical interface of the Valen vessel began to stutter as violet arcs of plasma danced across the viewport. Every calculated trajectory Xylos attempted to plot was instantly rendered useless by the shifting currents of dark matter. The nebula tore at the shuttle's shields with a ferocity that forced him to discard automated flight paths entirely and rely on manual corrections to keep the craft from spinning out of control. As the shuttle pushed deeper into the eye of the storm, the dark matter parted to reveal a sight that froze Xylos' breath. Floating in a hollow pocket of calm space was the Indomitable, resembling a floating mountain of scarred, black iron beaten by a blacksmith's hammer for 2 centuries. Its primary hull was warped into asymmetrical shapes that violated every principle of aerodynamic design, and huge patches of outer armor had been replaced with crude, overlapping plates of mismatched alloys held together by thick, uneven welding lines. Xylos brought the shuttle into orbit and launched scanning drones, but the data that returned made no logical sense. The main power grid of the Indomitable was completely dead, showing no signs of fusion or antimatter containment, yet thermal sensors indicated the central core maintained a habitable temperature and stable atmospheric pressure. The ship was functioning without an engine and holding itself together without structural integrity fields. Wedging his shuttle manually into the twisted frame of the airlock, Xylos donned his atmospheric suit and stepped into the dark, groaning corridors. The interior of the Indomitable was a claustrophobic nightmare of low ceilings, exposed structural ribs, and freezing air smelling of rusted iron. The walls were lined with thousands of thick, heavy cables torn from their original conduits and braided by hand into massive clusters that ran along the floor like the roots of an ancient tree. These makeshift cables pulsed with a faint electrical current that rose and fell like a labored tide, mimicking organic biorhythms. As the Valen team advanced, they found clear signs of an ancient, desperate struggle against environmental collapse, including handwritten logs and a massive calendar carved into the steel tracking decades spent in the dark. Beside it, the phrase "We are still here" was deeply etched into the bulkhead. There were no signs of mass graves, instead, the environment spoke of a hyper-focused collective will. When pipes had burst or gravity failed, the crew had used raw muscle, structural clamps, and melted personal belongings to fight the dead machinery. The humans had systematically stripped away every luxury, even cannibalizing advanced medical bays to reinforce the primary core with hammers, wrenches, and crude mechanical levers. Suddenly, the deep mechanical groaning of the hull was joined by a low, rhythmic thumping that reverberated through the metal walls like a massive, collective heartbeat. The air temperature rose rapidly to a suffocating heat as their scanners began to glitch violently, signaling that they were approaching the main engineering bay behind a set of heavily reinforced blast doors. Breaching the blast doors took the Valen team nearly an hour of careful plasma cutting against the thick, improvised steel reinforcement. When the heavy doors finally hissed open, they released a cloud of hot steam smelling of ozone and scorched skin. Xylos stepped through the threshold with his weapon raised, but slowly lowered it in disbelief. The engineering bay of the Indomitable had been transformed into a techno-organic cathedral, where the cracked fusion reactor core glowed with a fierce, unstable crimson light and thousands of hand-welded copper rods stretched outward like the spokes of a wheel. Sitting on a central platform surrounded by banks of flickering monitors was a group of humans who looked nothing like the frail explorers described in Coalition archives. They were thick-boned, weathered, and covered in heavy leather garments and salvaged plating bolted directly into their survival harnesses. They sat silently in heavy iron chairs, their hands resting on manual control levers, breathing the thick steam of the room in perfect unison with the rhythmic thumping of the reactor core. A tall woman with graying hair and a crude, mechanical prosthetic arm turned slowly to face the intruders, her intense green eyes showing no fear. "Took you long enough," she said, her voice a rough rasp. "We've been running that beacon for 80 years. Xylos adjusted his translator and announced his identity, stating that according to mathematical calculations, it was impossible for them to be alive. The woman let out a short, bark-like laugh, muttering that the numbers had died a long time ago out in the storm. Xylos stepped closer to the central console, demanding an explanation for an environment that defied all physical laws without a visible fuel source or active life support systems. The woman introduced herself as Captain Cross and explained that her great-grandparents had brought the ship into the storm. When the automated emergency systems shut down because they were programmed to know when a fight was mathematically lost, the human crew refused to sit down and wait for the dark. She detailed how they had pumped the air manually with bicycle chains and held the cracking hull together with their own body weight until welds could take. Xylos shook his head, arguing that muscle tissue and human stamina had strict biological limits that could not outwork a 2-century structural failure. He demanded to know where the millions of terawatts required to hold the ship together were originating. Captain Cross smiled, a terrifyingly dark expression settling on her face, and pointed toward the glowing core. Xylos adjusted his visor's magnification to focus on the base of the massive copper conduits lining the inside of the cracked reactor. His breath caught as he realized the rods weren't connected to fuel cells, but were bolted into a massive centralized neural lattice of silver cables running into biological containment pods that held human minds. The Valen team fell back in an instinctual defensive posture as Xylos' gauntlet finally began to decode the erratic energy signals. The power radiating through the Indomitable was a massive, highly concentrated field of psionic and kinetic energy generated by the collective focus of human brainwaves. Under the extreme pressure of certain annihilation, the human's baseline survival instinct had triggered an evolutionary mutation, fusing their minds into a singular, localized psychic engine. Captain Cross explained that during the 42nd year, while dying of radiation sickness with no medicine or clean water left, a group of engineering techs had grabbed the manual overrides and refused to let go. They sat there for 3 days, pouring every ounce of their hatred, spite, and desperate will to live into the machinery until it started working again. The human brain, she noted, could bend the rules of reality when left with nothing but the choice between absolute defiance and absolute nothingness. Xylos felt his entire worldview fracturing, realizing that these humans were literally thinking their ship into existence every second of every day to hold back the crushing weight of the nebula. When a scientist whispered that this was an act of biological heresy, Xylos asked how many people were connected to the engine. Cross replied that everyone was, noting that every child learned to hold a weld with their mind before learning to read, running on high octane for 200 years. The realization of what humanity had become changed the nature of Xylos' mission from a rescue operation to a volatile first contact scenario. He ordered his crew to lower their weapons and begin transmitting a secure data log back to the radiant axiom outside the storm so the High Council would understand that their mathematical formulas had left out human stubbornness. He then asked Cross why they had activated the beacon if their collective mind was already capable of mastering their own environment. Captain Cross walked back to the console, explaining softly that they didn't need a rescue, but a bridge. The engine kept their signal contained, leaving them blind to whether Earth was still out there or if the rest of their species had died. But now that your little shuttle has broken through, she said with a predatory gleam, you've left a clean warp trail in your wake. A mathematical path through the static that our engine is already using to map your cruiser. Panic spiked in Xylos' core as he reached to abort the data transmission, but his gauntlet interface went completely dead. Green bioluminescent lines from the human reactor crawled up his environmental suit, wrapping around his sensors like glowing vines and overriding his technology. The human crew members around the room suddenly opened their eyes, looking at him with an intense, hungry curiosity now that they finally had an objective outside the storm. Xylos demanded to know what they were doing, warning that an attack on a coalition vessel would result in their sector being hunted by fleets that commanded the energy of stars. Captain Cross remained unfazed, grabbing a massive iron lever on the console and pulling it down against an immense invisible resistance that caused her mechanical arm to vent white steam. She stated that they were simply coming out, tired of being contained after 200 years of fighting physics. As the lever clicked into position, the red light inside the reactor core shifted to a blinding white, and the deep thumping sound was replaced by an absolute, deafening silence. Outside the window, the clouds of the Moros nebula began to churn violently, being pulled into the cracked core of the reactor as the psychic engine reversed its polarity to consume the storm's gravitational energy for raw thrust. The massive, scarred ship began to move, accelerating along the warp trajectory left by the shuttle. Telemetry monitors briefly flickered back to life on Xylos' visor, showing the radiant axiom attempting to flee outside the nebula. However, the mathematics of escape velocity were useless against a ship propelled by 2 centuries of concentrated human spite. The Indomitable tore through space like an angry god, dragging the dark matter storm out with it wrapped around its hull like a cloak of cosmic thunder. The transition from the nebula to open space was instantaneous and violent as the Indomitable erupted from the dark matter clouds like a leviathan. The radiant axiom looked tiny and fragile beside the massive black iron colossus, and the human ship's expanding psychic field instantly washed over the alien cruiser. Every computational network on the Valen ship crashed simultaneously, replaced by a raw, pulsing crimson glow that mirrored the heartbeat of the human reactor. Trapped inside the engineering bay, Xylos found he could no longer move his crystalline limbs under the absolute psychic pressure holding him in place like amber. Yet, he wasn't dying. The human engine's capacity for endurance was extending to him, forcing him to feel a roaring torrent of collective memories, pain, and terrifying determination that made his own mathematical mind feel empty. Captain Cross walked over and tapped his visor, her voice carrying directly into his mind via the ambient field to tell him to relax because they were survivors, not killers. The Indomitable brought its massive bulk to a halt directly alongside the radiant axiom. As the 2 ships sat in the silence of deep space, Xylos realized with profound dread that the balance of power in the galaxy had shifted permanently toward a species that simply chose to keep walking when faced with a dead end. An hour later, the intense psychic field receded back to the Indomitable's outer hull, allowing Xylos' technological interfaces to flicker back to life and his limbs to move once more. Captain Cross stood before him with her mechanical arm folded across her chest, instructing him to return to his High Council and tell them that the humans from the Indomitable were coming home and bringing the storm with them. Xylos looked at the deep lines of pride etched into her face, choosing not to check his gauntlet for a mathematical rebuttal against the data standing right in front of him. He agreed to deliver the message but asked what would happen when her people returned to a peaceful galaxy balanced by math, where they no longer had a storm to fight. Captain Cross' smile faded into an expression of ancient weariness as her hand rested on the copper cables pulsing with the collective heartbeat of her species. She whispered that they did not know how to stop fighting after 200 years of tension, warning that if they didn't find something else to push against, they might just start pushing against everything else. Xylos returned to his shuttle and logged a final phrase into the archive. The universe is governed by math, but math has no defense against a species that refuses to accept the answer. If you like the video, make sure to like and subscribe my channel.